How's my hair?
It's pretty good. Yeah.
Donald Trump is a step closer to funding a war with Mexico.
But a 5-4 decision, the high court says it will lift a lower court freeze.
Well, the freeze had prevented the government from tapping approximately $2.5 billion in Defense Department money.
The Supreme Court ruled that Donald Trump can use military funding to build the wall.
The U.S.-Mexico border. It's campaign 2020, and if you are a Trump Republican, anything short of a bigger, better wall is a letdown. It's okay if Mexico doesn't pay for it, but immigration and border security are still your priorities. If you're a Democrat, detention camps, racial profiling, and federal raids are all part of the story you can't ignore, especially since 62% of Latinos say they lean Democrat. However you lean, you're going to want to make sure you get the full picture before casting your vote. Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today I'm going to dig into Latin America, where an exodus of people from Venezuela and Central America changing priorities across the region and also becoming a signature issue of America's campaign season. And who better to sort that out than a man who once served in the government of a nation undergoing massive economic collapse and now a source of the migration crisis in the region. Venezuelan-born minister turned columnist Moises Naím is here. And of course, I've got your puppet regime. And after discussing Venezuela, I bet you can't tell the difference.
They can fail, I can win, I can name, I can sing.
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. Let's start with some facts. Remember those?
With some what? Fake news alert, people. Fake news. What is that, velvet? What are you wearing?
The U.S. is home to the largest immigrant population on the planet.
Terrifying. If that's true, I'm going to send myself back to where I came from. I'm out of here.
I swear to God. 1 in 5 immigrants lives here. And they've mostly arrived in waves. Starting in the 1840s, it was the Irish and German Catholics. By the turn of the century, the Southern and Eastern Europeans. Of course, that's still just different parts of Europe. The U.S. immigration system favored predominantly white-skinned European countries. Shocking, I know. And yet, by the 1960s, much of that was set to change. Political pressures were mounting at the highest levels.
We are the descendants of 40 million people who left other countries, other familiar scenes, to come here to the United States to build a new life.
2 years later, Congress acted, prioritizing skilled workers and family members instead of a quota system. LBJ signed it into law.
This measure that we will sign today will really make us truer to ourselves, both as a country and as a people.
From then on, those from Asia, Africa, and particularly Latin America had their turn, and America's demographics began to change. In 1965, 84% of the population were non-Hispanic whites. Only 4% were Hispanic. Today, non-Hispanic whites make up 61% of the population. That's it. Hispanics now account for 18%, with Mexico emerging as America's largest source of newcomers. A quarter of all U.S. immigrants are Mexican, according to Pew. Of course, when the economy turns, newcomers with a different complexion are an easy scapegoat. But remember, the campaign issue today centers around the undocumented. And when it comes to U.S.-bound Mexicans, Pew estimates that more than 40% of them arrived illegally. President Trump has taken a number of steps to reduce that number. He campaigned for a wall, demanded billions to fund it, declared a national emergency, shipped U.S. troops to the border, threatened a trade war with Mexico over inaction, and even shut down the government for more than a month. And guess what? Unauthorized immigration is on the decline. Thing is, that number has actually been going down since 2007, long before either Trump or even Obama took office. There are 2 million fewer undocumented immigrants today than there were back then. U.S. Border Patrol has even reported the massive drop, apprehending less than half as many undocumented border crossers last year than they did back in 2007. So why the big emphasis today?
Those countries are sending the tough ones. They're sending the gang members. Those are the people they're sending to the United States.
Got it. So it's about gang violence. But even a cursory look at FBI numbers tells you America isn't as violent a place as it used to be. Violent crime has fallen by 49% since 1993. But maybe that's not the point, Mr. President.
And we're going to destroy the vile criminal cartel MS-13.
You have MS-13 gangs in different places.
MS-13, very important. We're taking them out by the thousands.
Okay, so it's specific Central American gangs that are the concern. For argument's sake, let's forget that MS-13 actually originated in Los Angeles and take President Trump at his word. Gangs with roots in Central America are dangerous. They carry out horrendous violence. They traffic hard drugs. And the Justice Department estimates there are some 10,000 gang members of MS-13 alone in the United States. But that's pretty much the same number as 10 years ago, so they're not growing. The point is, these are the guys, and they're almost always guys, to go after. So how do you attack this issue at its core? New law enforcement partnerships in Central America? Education programs to keep kids out of gangs? Support for local governance in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala? Or the opposite of all of that?
The State Department announced it would cut all foreign assistance to those three countries.
We pay them over $500 million. Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. We stopped the money.
Some people, if they haven't studied the issue or they haven't been down there, maybe don't understand what that foreign aid actually does. We're rerouting at-risk youth into training, into computer science away from MS-13.
Turns out that money, more than $560 million a year, is set to be diverted to Venezuelan opposition to pay the salaries of officials loyal to Juan Guaido, a man who's been unsuccessful at removing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from power. In other words, U.S. aid dollars meant to undermine MS-13 and reduce the reason Salvadorians, Guatemalans, and Hondurans flee their countries and head to the United States is set to be rerouted to fund government officials who actually aren't even in government. To be honest, I'm not sure what those guys are doing right now. I'm not suggesting there aren't good reasons to fund the opposition in Venezuela. Maduro is cozying up to those like Castro and Putin while his citizens sit on the brink of starvation. But if fixing immigration at the U.S. border is top priority, then removing resources from 3 unstable Central American countries will, well, I'll leave it to Texas Republican Congressman Michael McCaul.
If we cut all this funding, I think it's going to make things tragically worse, not better.
In the 21st century, power has become easier to acquire, harder to use, and easier to lose.
Moises Naím, distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, well-known author, new novelist, though we're not going to talk about that at all. So good to be with you.
Thanks for having me again, Ian. It's always a pleasure chatting with you.
I mean, so much to talk to you about. Latin America, usually a part of the world that's a little bit quieter in the headlines, but absolutely not now. And particularly in Venezuela, where you, for your sins, were actually in cabinet back in the 90s, thankfully not now.
Yeah, the challenge is huge, and people pay attention to the political situation and the difficulties and all of that, and the huge corruption of the Maduro government. But the story that is central there is that this is the largest economic collapse in history. There are no precedents to this. And all of this is driven by the fact that the productive capacity has been destroyed. The domestic industry that is for most sectors is very, very tiny now. Venezuela has the size, the Venezuelan economy now has the size of one of the Central American small countries. And this was the largest, wealthiest country in the region.
With the largest oil reserves proven in the world.
Today. And the fact is that oil exports have been declining at 15% per month in recent years. That is driven by a combination of the destruction of the oil industry, both because of thievery, of corruption, and because they just appoint their political cronies to run it. And they don't run it, they run it to the ground. And the other is sanctions, U.S. sanctions on the oil industry and the capacity of the oil industry to operate internationally. So the combination of all these things have made Venezuela, who used to be a petrostate, one of the world's largest players in the oil industry, now, instead of being a petrostate, is a narco state, because now narcotics trafficking is the dominant industry in the country.
So most of the money for the government, for the military today is no longer coming from oil production.
Exactly. It's coming from illicit activities, mostly narcotics, but also the illegal kind of exports of coltan, of gold, and Venezuela is very wealthy in terms of mineral, all kinds of minerals.
But with the level of collapse that you've talked about, again, unprecedented in this part of the world, in a very short period of time, why overwhelmingly is the military still with Mr. Maduro?
Because there is no exit for them. Most of them are either under tight control by the Cuban intelligence services, because the other big story that has not been sufficiently told is that Venezuela is now occupied by Cuba. The Cuban government plays significant roles in important decisions. There are very few decisions of state that have to do with international relations, with economy, with domestic politics, with repression, with the management of the country that are not controlled, influenced by the Cuban government. And so they are very good. The Cuban government has been very good at controlling. They have 60 plus years of running a very tight dictatorship. And the first thing you learn as a dictator is pay attention to the military. These are the guys that can do you in. So that's what's going on. No? And so there is repression, there is control, and the fact that they are the military, the top brass, is up to the ears in all kinds of dirty business.
But they can't be having anywhere close to the resource and the success that they were experiencing when the economy was actually booming comparatively.
Well, some of them, when the economy...
Because they ran the oil sector, too.
They run the oil sector relatively. But again, we're talking about a highly fragmented military. Some of them are actively involved in the cartels, in the drug cartels.
Now, you mentioned the Cubans, and you said that increasingly Venezuela is a country in terms of its power that's occupied by the Cubans. You didn't mention Moscow. Now, we talk a lot about Russia, of course, and perhaps too much in terms of the mainstream media these days, but certainly the Russians have wanted to show that they are putting their finger on the scale in favor of Maduro and his regime. What role do you actually see them playing?
Critical, and it was quite a surprise. They're a new player, they're a newcomer to this play. They have been very important suppliers of weapons during the 90s, during the Chavez era, period, from 1999 on. Venezuela under Chavez and then under Maduro became one of the biggest clients of Russian weaponry. That very often came with technical assistance and all kinds of support systems for that included members of the military. But then, not unlike what happened in Syria, where Russia was not a player originally, it was the United States and the European Union, Iran, and so on, and all of a sudden, Putin became a spoiler just Putin showed up, the Russians showed up, and now they're important players in Syria. Now, you cannot imagine a solution or a negotiation in Syria that does not include the Russians, which was not the case at the beginning. Same in Venezuela. The Russians today play a very important role. They played, recently there was an attempt to overthrow Maduro, in which the Americans and Secretary of State Pompeo recognized that they had high-level talks with the Minister of Defense, with the President of the Supreme Court, with the very important military people, with the head of intelligence. They had it all organized, and they were going to go ahead and remove Maduro.
Now, do you believe that? I mean, I say that because when there was a coup attempt against Erdogan in Turkey and it failed, I mean, those people were gone. They were arrested, they were purged, and in fact, they went much farther and much broader than, was complicit. Now, in the case of the coup attempt against Maduro in Venezuela, you had the United States government saying that they were in conversations directly with these senior Venezuelan officials, but after the coup attempt failed, those leaders are still in their roles, no purge whatsoever. So, I mean, how do we square that?
Power. The distribution of power. These individuals have their own power bases, in different kinds of ways, and they immediately turned and immediately started denouncing the United States, stating and restating their enthusiastic support for Maduro, explaining that they are all part of the same family that is countering the empire of the North, that they play them and so, and each one of them has sufficient power not to be overtaken or taken out.
So why do you think it failed?
I think it failed because they turned, and I believe
But why did they turn?
Because of the Russians. That is what Secretary of State Pompeo said publicly, that the Russians played a role in turning this around, and I have other sources here in Washington that confirm that.
So, despite all of the money, all of the control that they've had, they were willing to go against their own interests and their regime in support of the American administration that was not offering them much of anything until the Russians stepped in?
No. What they didn't have and they need is sustainability. This current situation is not sustainable. You cannot sustain this massive humanitarian crisis of people eating from the garbage cans in the streets, children dying in hospitals, people fleeing the country. 8,000 Venezuelans per day seek refuge in other countries. The inflation is the highest in the world.
Which gets you a couple million a year. That's a Syria-type crisis.
It's even larger. The Venezuelan displaced and the Venezuelan refugees is larger than Syria by now. And it will continue if nothing happens and the situation in Venezuela, the economic situation doesn't get better. You will continue to have desperate people that are willing to walk to another country, typically Colombia, and that will destabilize Colombia. If you get 1 more million Venezuelans walking to Colombia, and they are taxing their social systems, their schooling, their health, their housing, their job market.
And your view, if you could make a recommendation to the Trump administration about anything that they might do differently than what they've done so far, you would say what?
At this point, we have had from them a lot of talk about and action with sanctions, and they have been very effective. I think that was well designed and it's working. But there is this constant dangling of all options are on the table, meaning the military option is on the table. And that has created expectation and is a distraction.
And Guaido's talked about it even. Yeah.
And everybody talks about it. But then you talk to the people that in the administration or in the Pentagon and elsewhere, and you don't see that there is so much appetite for a military intervention. With whom? With which legitimacy? Are you going to go to Congress and require authorization for that? Are you going to go to the United Nations and seek the Security Council
and
support?
Which allies?
Which will not happen, right? Yeah. And is President Trump willing to just go it alone and try to do it? And how? And what do you?
I think if they just put Bolton in a plane, I think that could be.
Yeah, well, it's a possibility.
So, okay, let's move from Venezuela. We could talk about it for hours, but Lord knows your involvement around Latin America is also extremely long-lasting. And I'd love to ask you about a little of that. Another place big in the news right now is Mexico.
Yeah.
And the potential for a trade fight between the United States and the Mexicans. Were you surprised that this is now, after the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement was moving to ratification, were you surprised to see the trade and immigration issue right back in the headlines?
I was surprised by the timing, not by the action. I always expected that as domestic politics in the United States and the electoral calendar grew close to events, that Trump would lash out against Mexico. That's what, remember, when he declared that he was going to run for president of the United States, the essence of that message was about Mexico
Stopping
and
the
China,
Mexicans
and stop the Mexicans, the criminals, and the
rapists, he said,
rapists, and all the horrible things. And that apparently that has paid off. He's convinced that there is a base, that there is a political base that needs that, and I think he's going to play that.
Is it fair to say that López Obrador, the Mexican president, really does not want that fight?
No, he's not. Actually, he has stated it several times. It is in writing. It is the official policy of the Mexican government. And López Obrador, the president, constantly repeats it. He says, my mantra is, I repeat it every day, I will not fight with the United States. I will not fight against the United States. And he repeats it. He doesn't want to fight with the United States, but it seems like, well, López Obrador doesn't want to fight. President Trump needs a fight with Mexico. So we see these clashing interests, both driven by, electoral and political calculus.
Now, López Obrador is an incredibly powerful politician in the Mexican context. His popularity is enormous. He's got control in both houses of Congress. Can he work through this without experiencing a lot of damage internally, irrespective of whether tariffs go up or not?
Sure, he can turn this around and explain that whatever bad economic situation happens in Mexico, and Mexico may suffer from López Obrador policies. But then he can blame the United States, and he can blame Trump. He says, the situation is bad because you can see what Trump has done to us. So Trump is providing a cover for whatever economic malpractice and bad economic policies that López Obrador will be undertaking.
So do you think there's going to need to be a shift from the Mexican president if these tariffs come on to start blaming Trump directly? Is he going to start needing the fight?
I think he will try to avoid that because his political cycle is different. He was elected for 6 years,
recently, yeah.
So he still has a lot to wait for, and the run for that is still long.
Moises Naím, great to see you, my friend.
Same here. Thank you, Ian.
And now for something completely different, I've got your puppet regime.
Daddy, it's Don. I saw you're up late, but you're not tweeting or watching TV. Are you okay?
I can't go on, Junior.
What?
It's too much.
What?
This is the hardest I've had to work in ever.
Ever? Dad, don't say that. Why?
I can't think of any more nicknames for these Democrats.
What?
It's motley crew. There's already like 20 of these losers. I can't think of any more.
Oh, come on, Dad. You can do it. Do it for America. Do it for us. Do it for the media.
The media? The failing fake news media? They can fail. I can win. I can name. I can sing. La la la. You're lazy, you're crazy, you're kooky, crooked, dopey, goofy, creepy, fat or shady. You're sneaky, you're wacky, you're low IQ and sloppy. You're sleepy, flaky, leaking, lying, pencil next, there's no denying. Look at me, I'm hardly trying. Guys, you make it way too easy. Nervous, feeling nasty, sleazy. Still got it. You're nut jobs, you're slime balls, you're stone cold losers. You're little slippery, deranged, low energy snoozers. You're angry, conflicted, crying clowns and clinkers. Washed up psychos, dumb and phony, stupid wackos. Don't you know me? Failed and weak, insane and sour, vicious. This is my great power. I'm the greatest of all time. Your nicknames suck compared to mine. I mean, seriously, gandan? Does this loser even know what that means in Mexican? Look it up. Forget debates on policy, pick up your phone and follow me. These antics, these tantrums, these gaslit lanterns. Watch me as I hold the whole new cycle up for ransom. I'm outrageous, I'm contagious, I'm a symptom of the ages. Just the way this works, I game the circus D-R-U-M-B. You can't spell media without me. Good luck to the media without me.
That's our show this week. And you know what? I mean, if you had a show, you could be doing this instead of me. That'd be, we could change it up. But until that happens, I'll be back next week. You must do this. You must be right here. We'll be chatting. Don't miss it. In the meantime, but if you like what you've seen, get all interactive. Check us out on GZEROmedia.com. Send a note. Tell me what you think. Someone might read it. See you soon.